Well, welcome everybody to the third plenary lecture of this morning. My name is June Barrow-Green. I'm chair of the International Commission on the History of Mathematics, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the talk by Catherine Goldstein. Catherine earned her PhD, which was on p-adic L functions and Usawa theory, at Paris South University under the direction of John Coates. Since then, she has held positions at CNRS in Orsay and in Paris, first as a number theorist and then as a historian of mathematics. And she's now a director of research at CNRS. She's worked mostly in the history of number theory, both in the 17th century and in the 19th and 20th centuries. And she's also run projects on mathematics during the First World War and on structure and circulation of mathematical knowledge and on gender and mathematics. She's especially interested in theoretical issues of historiography and in developing a social history of mathematics and mathematical practices and results, most specifically in the collective aspects of mathematics and how it helps us to understand the creation and development of mathematics. She's the author of numerous papers and books, and I'd particularly highlight her work on Fermat and on Gauss's Disquisitiones Arithmetica, and amongst other things, she's a founding member of Femmes et Mathématiques and is a member of the Scientific Council of CNRS. Catherine is one of today's most influential historians of mathematics, both through her own work and through the work of her many PhD students. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Catherine to give her talk on long-term history and ephemeral configurations. Thank you.
So thank you very much, June. Thank you for the organizing committee and the program committee for giving me this extraordinary opportunity to speak about history of mathematics. Thank you for the weather, which probably helped a bit people to come back here. And thank you for all of you to be here now. So, as I am very impressed by the opportunity, of course, I prefer to put myself under the banner of somebody you all know, who was the first plenary speaker ever at an ICM, Henri Poincaré, and a very famous sentence he wrote a few years after the ICM in Zurich, where he said, "Mathematics is the art of giving the same name to different things." Now, it's very clear that in this sentence for Poincaré, the word which should be emphasized is same. It was at a time, around 1900, a time of big restructurations in mathematics, where a lot of varied and dispersed phenomena or objects were put under same names. And the two examples chosen by Poincaré in his paper I think were very significant of that. They also help us to measure the distance from this time to ours, because the two examples were uniform convergence and group, which were presented both as new phenomena, at least understood. Now, it would seem that we could use exactly the same emphasis to write long-term history of mathematics, going from giving the same name to things to thinking of these things as the same, both in past and in the present. Now, as you probably all know, this path has not been the path chosen by the historian of mathematics since a few decades. In fact, we are not going to, for the moment, emphasize the word same, but much more the word different and the word art. We are interested in looking at the differences between all these things that mathematicians at one point have put together under the same name. And we are also interested in the art of mathematics, in particular, how the mathematicians are working, what are their practices when they put the same name on things or different name on things. So just to give you a few examples of this point of view, which has been around for a few decades. For instance, in the 80s, recent historiography measured events of the past against the standards of their time, not against the mathematical practices of today. Or some program I borrowed from a very well-known historian, Thomas Hawkins. The challenge to the historian is to depict a mathematical theory so as to capture the diverse ways in which that theory was a vital part of the mathematics and mathematical perceptions of the era which produced it. So this point of view has been around since the 80s, and I think it's important first to explain why it was around and what was at stake there. Then I will give some illustration of it, and then I will come back to the question of long-term history and open questions at the end of my talk. So, what was at stake? Well, you have to remember, or you have to learn for the youngest of us, that the 70s and still a bit the 80s were a time of big turmoil, including political turmoil, and also a time where science was criticized. And the practice of sciences was put into questions. And a lot of history of mathematics and sociology of mathematics developed in this political setting, where it was important for people to understand how to integrate the social aspects into the picture of the development of mathematics. Now, you can think, of course, of direct political issues, but more generally of educational reforms, for instance, of philosophical worldviews informing the mathematics, including the mathematical results and practices, or industrial needs. We have seen a lot of examples this week of those different issues. So that was one of the points. The other point was really to restitute mathematics as a collective activity, not only the achievement of a few important persons, but really as a lot of collective activity. I show you here on the picture, the first view is a view of the French Association for the Advancement of Science, which developed a lot and produced a lot of new mathematics in the 19th century. And the second view, of course, is a very famous one showing Hermann Weyl and Emmy Noether with a lot of younger people and students during a walk in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. So we want to understand the collective aspect, and we want to situate the individual achievement inside this collective aspect. Another important issue, which has developed perhaps more in details recently, and I will insist on that, is to take into account what we have recognized as the many layers inside a mathematical activity and inside a mathematical text. For instance, how the solution of a problem is evaluated, what counts as a good solution to a problem, which changes in time a lot, how information circulates, what are the components of a mathematical life and a mathematical work. I just show you here one very famous example, of course. It's perhaps the most famous theorem of all mathematics. It's Fermat's last theorem. The little note, I don't know if I can show you this, yeah, here. Or, no, okay, well, here. But this text, as you see, it's a free author's text, in fact. There is a text by Diophantus, a Greek author of the Antiquity, and there are a lot of comments by Gaspard Bachet de Mézières, which is the generation before Fermat. So how these different authors interfered in this text, and how does it bear an important information of what Fermat did, for instance? This is an important question, where you have to restitute the whole components of the text. Another example, of course, it's inside the correspondence, how people in the correspondence, would elaborate together mathematics, or what are the traces of the activity of several persons inside a letter, for instance. And last but not least, at least for me, and it has been really one thing which interests me a lot, it's to also reflect critically on our historical practice. In particular, how we describe our findings. Because we tended to use words like school or disciplines because they have been used a lot by mathematicians themselves. And I think in the last decade, we have learned to be a bit cautious about the use of this term, try to understand how they are shaped and what they mean really. And for instance, how the classification of things in mathematics, how the different disciplines of mathematics are very time dependent. I just show you here two different classifications. One is the Jahrbuch, the ancestor of the Zentralblatt in some respect, and the other one is the Catalogue of Scientific Papers, and they are very different representation of the discipline at the same time. So what I would like to do now, so what I have to explain is that going from this idea of the same to the idea of looking at the art of mathematician and situating in the practice of his or her own time means that we have left the focus on long-term history and we have tended to focus on short-term configuration where we could really explain the relationship between all these components. Okay? So I would like to explain now, to give you two examples of that. And then I will come back at the end on the issue of the long-term history, which I think is a very important issue and an open question for us now. So my example will be minimal examples in some respect. I have really tried preparing this talk to find the most boring and simple example I could find. I hope they are not too boring. And in particular, I will stay in the middle of the classical academia, European academia, with essentially men figures, because I wanted to show you that even in these very restricted situations, you could see a lot of components of various nature coming in and being important for the establishment of concept or mathematics. And the common point with my two examples is they are all about Hermitian forms. So here, Hermitian form would be a very simple form of Hermitian form, so to speak. That's just an expression. I will not say what is this expression because it changed depending on the authors. An expression of this type. The bar is, of course, the complex conjugation here. And so it's an expression of this type with so the coefficient A, I, G being complex conjugate for the symmetry part, and so the diagonal coefficients are real numbers. So my first example would try to answer to a very simple question. Did Charles Hermite invent Hermitian forms? And how? I think it's an important question because it's typically the question that we are asked, historians of mathematics, all the time. Did so and this person invent such thing? And normally, what you get when you ask an historian about that is really a blank look, like, well, yeah, no, well. And we look really like idiots most of the time. And I would like to explain to you why. That is, to explain to you why a simple answer to even this question is not very easy. So Charles Hermite, you probably know him like that. At the end of his life, a very famous mathematician, full of honors, a member of a lot of societies and academies, and quite reactionary, in fact, in his outlook and in his thoughts. But the Charles Hermite which will interest me now is this one. Yeah, it happens. So he was a young guy in his late 20s, beginning of his 30s. He has just dropped out of École Polytechnique for health reasons, and also because he didn't like the idea of becoming an engineer or a military person. And he wanted to devote himself completely to pure mathematics. But he had already a lot of contact, scientific contacts in all Europe about several subjects, for instance, complex analysis, number theory, algebra. And when my story begins, he had just proved an important theorem on the minima of forms. So, what is this theorem? He considered a quadratic form, let us say definite quadratic form, with n plus 1 variables, or indeterminates, as they say at the time, and real coefficients and a certain determinant d, which is essentially the modern definition of the determinant. Okay? These results were presented in letters to the very famous German mathematician Jacobi, and Jacobi will publish them both in his own work, and then it will also be published in Krell's journal, which existed already at the time. So what is the result? It's probably all very well known by you, but okay, the result is, for this form with real coefficient, that you can find integers such that the value of the form with real coefficient on these integers is less than a certain bound, and this bound doesn't depend on the coefficients of the forms, but only on the number of indeterminates and the determinant. So it's a bit bizarre to have this theorem at the time, because essentially quadratic forms at the time came from different type of domains, and then didn't mix together integer and real coefficients or values. So let me just recall you that, and it's quite important. Quadratic forms appeared in mechanics, for instance, for the computation of moments and other problems, also in celestial mechanics. They would appear in number theory with integer coefficients. I will come back on that because it was an important source of inspiration for Hermite. And there will also be an influence on him of question of analysis, in particular approximation theory. So this theorem, already in its statement, mixing inequality, real coefficients, and integer values, values at integers, sorry, is already a mixing on certain fields, certain domains, which before didn't mix so much. Okay? And reciprocally, it has a variety of application, an enormous variety of application by Hermite himself in his letters. So, for instance, rational approximation of real numbers, periods of analytic complex functions, factorization of prime numbers into algebraic numbers, classification on forms with integer coefficient, and a few number theoretical, very classical theorems on which I will come back. So you may want to have a more concrete idea of how it works, so I just give you one example of that, which is the simultaneous approximation of real numbers by fractions as an application of this theorem. Again, it's a very elementary one, but okay. So you take, for instance, two real numbers. It works with any number of real numbers. You take a delta, any positive number you want, and then you introduce a form where the a, the b, and the delta are taken inside the coefficients of the form. It will be a general idea there. You have a certain data, a certain situation, and you encapsulate this data into the coefficient of a quadratic forms. It will be the same thing for every application by Hermite on this theorem. Now, because of the theorem, it means that you can find some integers such that the value of the form on these integers is less than a certain bound. So it's written there, you have a sum of square or positive numbers, so each of them is, oops, sorry. Each of them can be bound, and then you can also bound the 1 over the roots of delta by 1 on m, and then so you have immediately your common approximation of a and b with fractions with the same denominators. Okay? So it's a very simple application of the theorem. Another application which was very important for Hermite is the beginning of the classification of forms with n variables to 6. And he proved that forms with with a determinant 1 for n equals 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, were in fact in the same class. That is, they were all the same up to a change of linear change of variables with integer coefficient, invertible linear change of variable with integer coefficients. That is, essentially, all this form can be reduced to a sum of squares with the number of squares equals the number of variable. So again, you may think, what is that? Why a question of classification is connected with a question on bounds? Well, in fact, it was already the case in the number theoretical situation which Hermite found in Gauss's Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, where it's a question of classifying only the binary quadratic forms, so 2 variables, with integer coefficients. So classify them, meaning up to a change, invertible change of a variable with integer coefficient, we would say SL2 of z or GL2 de z in some cases. And so Gauss pointed out the importance for this classification of the determinant as an invariant in this change of variables. He showed that there is a finite number of equivalent forms with a given determinant, and he had also a program to determine good representatives of the form in each class. Good representative meaning simple representatives, and it means forms with small coefficients. How small? Well, I give you an example here. For instance, for definite forms, a reduced form is such that the first coefficient a should be less than something square root of the determinant, and you have also some inequalities on the other coefficients. So if you look carefully, it means that for the reduced form, the a, the first coefficient, is less than a certain bound. But the first coefficient of a form, it's the value of the form on 1, 0. So it's a specific value of the form. So it means that up to a change of variable, it's also a specific value for all the forms which are equivalent to this one. And as the form depends, the bound depends only on the determinant, it means that you have found for all the forms with this determinant a value at integers which is less than a certain bound. It is exactly the theorem of Hermite in the case of binary quadratic forms. So you see here that a problem on classification is somehow equivalent to a problem giving a bound on values at integers. So I think it's an interesting and nice thing, because you can imagine the young Hermite reading very carefully the Disquisitiones, where this connection is not at all put forward, and really making his way to read very, very carefully every details of the proofs in the Disquisitiones and find this new perspective on things to state his own theorem. So he generalized this by his classification of form, as I said, and I think it's very important for him that he was able to have result in classification, because it outlook of things that really mathematics should be an enterprise of classification. So for instance, in the same letter to Jacobi, he would say that the task for number theory and integral calculus is to penetrate into the nature of a multitude of entities of reason, he said, to classify them into mutually irreducible groups, just grouping, and it's nothing to do with the group structure, to constitute them all individually through characteristic and elementary definition. So you may think that it sounds really as if mathematics is a natural science. You are perfectly right if you think so. For people like Hermite and a few other people at his time, mathematics was really a natural science, like biology, like natural science, like zoology and botanics, and it should be described and done exactly in the same way. So, for instance, I'll show you another quote which is very explicit in this respect. The feeling you expressed, Hermite wrote to Ludwig Königsberger, one of his German correspondents, in this passage of your last letter, when you said to me, "It seems to me that the main task now, just as is descriptive natural history, consists in accumulating as much material as possible, and in discovering principle by classifying and describing this material." This feeling, I say, is also mine, and in this simple and precise form you have summarized with respect to mathematics the deep and intimate conviction of my entire life as mathematician. I thus believe that even the most abstract analysis is, for the most part, an observational science. So it's really a way of doing mathematics in a certain, with a certain analogy with zoology or botanics. And you will see that it's very important to describe the birth of some respect of Hermitian forms. I want to point out that he was not at all isolated. Well, as you saw in the first letter to Königsberger, Hermite was referring to a quote by Königsberger himself. But we have a lot of testimony of other mathematicians of the time who would think exactly the same about mathematics as a natural science. For instance, here, Sylvester. My own work will very strikingly illustrate how much observation, divination, induction, experimental trial, and verification, causation too, have to do with the work of a mathematician. And I could multiply the example. For instance, the historian Tony Quilly described Arthur Cayley, the mathematician, as a naturalist. And you can see, for instance, in the insistence of Cayley to describe the minute aspects of invariant theory, as a result of his view that you have to establish really all the details on kind of living being that were the various invariants attached to various situations. So, classification was at the core of the work of Hermite for a long time. And for instance, he would classify forms with integer coefficient, I've said it, but also forms with real coefficients, with the signature things, what you know now very well. He was also working in invariant theory and so on and so on. So, back to Hermitian forms. So the beginning of that was a very classical problem in number theory, which was that the fact that any integer is a sum of 4 squares. So he would develop a demonstration of this theorem based on his theorem on the minima of forms. So again, you introduce a quadratic form with the number you want to decompose as a sum of squares in it. You also choose two other numbers, another integer, alpha and beta, such that auxiliary numbers, if you wish, by congruence conditions, A divides alpha to the square plus beta to the square plus 1. If you look at these quadratic forms, its determinant is the 4th power of A, and you can directly apply the main theorem and conclude. Why? Because if you look at the bounds given to you by the main theorem, you see that there exist some integer values of the indeterminates, of the variable, if you wish, such that the value of the form at these integers is less than something like 1.5 times A. But at the same time, given the choice of alpha and beta and A, it's very easy to see that the value of these forms at integers should be an integral multiple of A. So it could be A, it could be 2A, it could be 3A, and so on. So the only possibility less than 1.5A is A itself. And so it shows you that the value of the form at this integer you have found through the main theorem should be exactly A. And so you have A as a value of the form that is as a sum of 4 squares. So you are done. Or you could have been done if Hermite was not obsessed by classification. So he would like a proof which really relied on classification. And for that, he looked not at this form, but at 1 over A times this form. This new form has determinant 1. And so by his theorem on classification, it's equivalent to a sum of squares. So a sum of 4 squares. Okay? So when you write the equivalence, that is the change of variables, we will transfer your form f over a to the sum of square. You find that if you identify the first coefficient on each side, you have directly an expression of a as a sum of 4 squares. So, of course, it's the same proof in some respect because it turns against the same idea. But it has a very important effect because if you look at this new form and you recompute the coefficients, which Hermite was doing all the time, new computation and new development with his algebraic expression, you see that you can put the form putting very, oops, sorry for that. We're grouping terms together here, x, y, x to the square plus y to the square, z to the square plus u to the square. And I don't know for you, but certainly for Hermite, it's strongly suggested that some complex numbers could be involved here. So he had this idea to rewrite, to look at forms from the point of view of complex numbers, expressing these sort of things with complex numbers. So he introduced complex numbers. Note that he will not use the bar to give the complex conjugation, but an index 0. And so he will look at that, but what is really interesting is that he wanted really to look at the species of quadratic forms and to look at transformation which will keep this kind of new species of quadratic forms he had detected. So the first thing he did was to change the transformation he will authorize on forms. So he will not take all the real transformations which he has used before, or all the transformation with integer coefficients. He will look at specific transformation which would keep the structure he had detected on the form, the complex structure he had detected on the form. Okay, so it's what he explained that. I will not go into the details of that for sake of time. If you want to express this transformation with real variables, you have what you expect, of course, nowadays. But what is really important is that if you look at these transformations, you can prove that they preserve a certain type of quadratic forms, which you can express only with complex variables. Okay, so this is the complex writing of the same forms. And if you look carefully at these forms, which we somehow recognize now at Hermitian forms, in fact, if you transfer these forms with real coefficients, what you find here is essentially a type of forms of which the form used for the theorem on the 4 squares was a prototype. So the main thing is really to identify inside the whole set of quadratic form this particular species of forms which has a kind of complex structure which you can preserve with a specific kind of transformation. So it's exactly what he said. We shall thus consider the quadratic forms, blah, 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 in which the extreme coefficients A and C are assumed to be real, while the coefficient, the medium coefficient are conjugate complex numbers. Considered with respect to the primitive variables, these forms are entirely real, but their study from the point of view of the transformations we have just defined essentially rely upon the use of complex variables. One is led to attribute to them an existence which is singularly analogous to that of quadratic form with 2 variables, although they contain 4 indeterminates. So, why it is interesting? It's because it's a follow-up of his program on classification. So he will not only allow various kinds of coefficients in the transformation, he would now look at subgroups of transformation and look at the kind of forms they can preserve. So we have an example we just described with Hermitian forms, or what will be called later Hermitian forms. He will develop that not only for two complex variables, but also for n complex variables, with so 2n variables quadratic forms. But he will also do the same for other situations. For instance, studying the transformation in abelian functions. So I spoke about complex analytic functions. He will also find new species of particular form for with 4 indeterminates, other type of species. We call them now symplectic forms, but there was no name attached to them, but there were also a kind of specific quadratic forms for Hermite. So it is important because it's really showed how his view on what should be done in mathematics, compute, observe, and look at transformation between species, is absolutely crucial in its development of even what we considered as new material. In particular, his point of view was absolutely opposed to the point of view which we will find later in the century by people like, for instance, Denkind, claiming that the essence of mathematics is freedom and you can create freely your concept. For Hermite and for a certain number of people who shared his view at the time, you don't create your concept. He accepted the forms he just found because there were subspecies inside a big group of already known variety of forms. Okay? So as he said here, I reject as totally false that geometers are the creator of their science. Mathematics, and especially abstract analysis, is the result of observation and not an arbitrary creation of the mind. So in some respect, if you want to understand the whole situation, the whole configuration, you have a set of tools, you have technique of proofs, you have all the new problems coming from different domains of interest, you have an extraordinary interesting emphasis on linear transformations, and it's important because it's also something which help him to classify things. And he had a mathematical worldview with an impact on the practice of mathematics and how an entity can be accepted or not inside mathematics. Well, I have no time to develop other cases, but in some cases he will not accept something which seems new because it seems ad hoc, it seems arbitrary. It didn't come from the practice of classification and observation. So Hermitian forms are not really new objects. It's why I said, can I answer the question, did Hermite invent Hermitian form? Well, he didn't invent Hermitian form, he detected them inside already known type of forms. Okay? So this is my first example, and I would like to go a bit quickly on my second example, which is a very different thing. In the case of Hermite, I zoomed in, explained the situation around him and explained how it works in his work. Here I would zoom out very quickly and explain how Hermitian forms came into a new field. This is also very natural questions. How a mathematical object came from one field and go to another. So I've chosen, you have seen already that there were somehow in analysis, number theory, and so on. So I chose a very different domain, which is geometry, and used a beautiful work done by a lot of Italian colleagues here, where they put on a website all the courses and lecture notes of Corrado Segre. And inside these notes, you find, precisely here, you find a little occurrence, it's almost the only symbol, a little occurrence of Hermitian forms. So I was curious and suggested that we look that together. So this is the website by Livia Giacardi. So in fact, there is only one reference in this course, and it is to a text by German geometer von Staudt. And so I will look first at von Staudt's theory of geometry and how Segre interpreted it in the case of his own course and work. So von Staudt was in Erlangen there is a list of important geometry connected with Erlangen, but I will go quite quickly on that. And the book, which is referred to by Segre, is called The Geometry of Position. This was a term which was also designated at the time as projective geometry, or pure geometry, or synthetic geometry, according to the authors. I will not comment on that. So there was first an edition in 47, and then there were supplements, I will explain why, which were published a bit later. So the main point of von Staudt was to get rid of any kind of magnitude and measurement in geometry. So it was a project which was going on for several decades with other authors, but it was perhaps the most radical in this perspective. It would also display a very interesting outlook on what is pedagogy. So I can't resist, even if it's not directly connected to my point, to show you that any geometrical course should proceed from general considerations which make the student familiar with the different type of geometrical entities and exercise his power of intuition. So this is what it looks like. So I don't know how your power of intuition is really aroused by this sort of text. There is absolutely no drawing in all the text. And this is quite interesting because it makes a real difference pedagogically between intuition, mental representation, and visualization by figures. If you are interested in this aspect, I can't comment on that, but there will be a talk this afternoon by Gemma Lorenat on the use of figures in geometry, on not use in geometry. In any case, he had 6 students in his course. So it may explain why it was easier, of course, to develop with them a mental representation without any figure, but you are more than 6, so I will add some figures to explain this text. So just to give you an idea of the type of thing you will do, I have no time to really enter the details in that, but for instance, lots of geometry at the time relied on the Cauchy ratio. So the Cauchy ratio is, of course, ratio of magnitudes. So as he wanted to get rid of magnitudes, he had to get rid of the Cauchy ratio. But what he would do, we simply redefine what was to be in harmonic relation for 4 points, which means that the Cauchy ratio, if it existed, would be -1, only by purely geometrical construction. So for instance, here, you would see that you would give him 3 points and then construct a quadrilateral, the blue one, such that a diagonal of the quadrilateral pass through the middle point, B, and that the 2 sides, pair by pair, pairwise, would go to the 2 other points. And then the last diagonal, the orange one, would define uniquely a point, a 4th point on the line, and that will be, the 4th point will be the 4th harmonic point for the first point. So that's typical a sort of construction which will allow him to get rid of magnitudes and replace them by geometrical construction. So very quickly, he will define projectively relation between figures by saying that the harmonicity is preserved. So I just define harmonicity on a line. You can extend that to other situations, but so it's a relation between figures. And okay, it will have a fundamental theorem decided that a projective relation is between 2 ranges of points, for instance, is determined by the data of 3 couples, 3 points and their images, in a unique way, and he will extend that to 2 and 3 dimensions. Of course, we are in a time where the geometry was only to 3 dimensions. This fundamental theorem has a strange demonstration and a strange history, and it will be rewritten and reproved several times. It was an incomplete demonstration in von Staudt, and it will be one of the sources of the interest for this geometry. So I will just show you here what 2 figures, 2 range of points which are projectively related. What I want to point out is only this thing, that you don't define a projection or a projectivity. What you define is a relation between two figures, and it's very important. That is, you define what are the relation between these two figures, but you don't identify as an object the relation itself, so you don't comment it. One important, and it was the last thing I will describe, one important thing was, in particular, a specific relation between figures, which was already projectively related, and this is that they are in an involution. It means that when you go from one point to another by this relation, then if you apply the relations to the second point, you come back to the first point. So we would say order 2 relation if you wish. So what von Staudt showed is that in the case of the line, for instance, I represented line, we are in projective geometry, so I represented line by circle. You had 2 situations. You can have double points for your involution, or you can have no double point, fixed point. So I show you here 2 different situations. You see that the double points at the left, they are the point of tangent from the relation to the circle. And the second situation, there is no double point. Why was it important? It's because in order to give to projective geometry the same kind of generality that you had in algebra or analysis, you needed to introduce complex numbers or complex points. And the problem was, how do you do that when you don't authorize coordinates? We don't authorize magnitudes. So von Staudt, for instance, said, where everybody asked, is the imaginary point when one abstracts oneself of the system of coordinates? So his idea was that, in fact, in the situation of the involution, you will describe the second situation as a situation where you have 2 imaginary double points. So he was not pleased with this construction, which was in the 47 edition, because he couldn't distinguish between the 2 conjugate points. He has the 2 points at the same time, the 2 imaginary points of the involution. And in the supplements, he will develop a theory based on direction, so he will impose a direction on the line or on other figures, and he will use this direction to explain how you can distinguish between the 2 complex conjugate points you have introduced as double point of involution. And so he will keep only the projective relations which preserved the direction. So it's an important point, but I have no time to comment that. So this is the direction thing. What I just want to say is that I just explained very briefly and superficially what happens on the line. He will extend that to all sorts of figures in the plane and in the space. And as I said, restricting himself to projective relation, leaving the direction invariant. So you could think that it's really an abstract and complicated way to do geometry. And as I said, one important aspect of the transmission was that the main theorem of the theory was somehow incomplete and not well-founded, so it drew the attention of several mathematicians to complete the demonstration. But more spectacularly, perhaps, it found its way in a very applied field. Namely the art of construction and graphical statics, which were taught to engineers all over Europe at the time, and in particular in Zurich, in the ancestor of the ETH, at the Polytechnicum, the professor of geometry and static graphics, Karl Kuhnmann, would be an enormous promoter of von Staudt's geometry. He explained that he has always found it easier to remind the students of the theorem of the geometry of positions, the proof of which could be done directly on the lines of the blueprint themselves. So you have to imagine these student engineers doing the technical drawing, and were able to understand the geometrical facts they needed directly by drawing lines on their blueprints. Then to use analytical computations, the expansions of which required a separate sheet of paper. So you see here a very concrete reason while you would import extremely abstract geometry in a very applied field. And it's not for, only for intellectual reasons, but it's also because in a practical way, it was easier to go on drawing lines than to take another sheet of paper to do computations. And so, explained Kuhlmann, I was led almost irresistibly to replace as far as possible algebra by geometry of position. So just to give you an example, sorry for this bout of nationalism, but Kuhlmann's student Koechlin, for instance, used a lot of geometry, projective geometry, and particularly Staud's geometry in his maps of the Eiffel Tower. So I put you here one of the drawing. So it's important that you have to understand that it was really through the engineer system that von Staud geometry was somehow taught and developed all over Europe and elsewhere. So I will not comment that because I have no time. I will just come back in particular to one specific place, which is Italy. We are just at the moment where, after the Risorgimento, Italy became unified. You have here the map where you see the old state of Italy before the unification. As usual, such a very important change, political change, went on with a lot of educational reforms. So there were two good reasons, and this reform took place, importing geometry in the curricula in Italy. So one was somehow national and with a worldview, of what geometry was for the Italian culture. So there was an idea to reconnect with the classical tradition of Italy, Rome, and the Greece, the classical traditions. So geometry was important in this context and explicitly important. And the other one was an attempt for modernization and development of engineering courses and engineering engineers in general, engineering schools. And in this context, you can see a map where we listed a lot of the course in projective and descriptive geometry were done in Italy. So this is the context. You can see a lot of courses in descriptive geometry and projective geometry being taught at the time. I just show you here that it went on for a while because one of the students of these people here, in fact in Severia, he should go to Severia and not only Enriquez, is Achille Bassi, who would come to Rio and then Sao Paulo and then Sao Carlos and would teach at the end of the 1930s. He will teach projective geometry in Brazil, for instance. So it's a long-time tradition. So just a list here, which I will not comment on all the books of projective geometry who were done at the time. So you have to understand that in this context. So if we look specifically in Torino, we see that there are a lot of people connected with these courses. So again, I will not comment all of them, but it's interesting that there were here people like Segre, but also like Peano, like Fano, like Pieri. And if I concentrate on specifically Corrado Segre, so he left, he was all his life, in Torino, as student, assistant, and professor. But he had also strong connection with Felix Klein in Germany, we consider as a kind of master at a distance. And he was extremely active, organizing translations from important works for him, from German to Italian. So, for instance, he had the von Staud geometry of position translated into Italian by Mario Pieri, who would afterwards develop an axiomatic of the geometry. And he has also Klein's Erlangen program, so this big program you probably very well know, which associated to each geometry the group of transformation which stabilized the geometry, also translated in Italian by Fano, which, the Fano of the Fano variety. And himself was trying to develop, in this context, a new field for geometry. So he was not pleased with the way imaginary points were presented in the followers of von Staudt. In order to simplify the presentation, most of the people who were the followers of von Staudt, in particular in engineering school, would simply say that you introduce the two imaginary points associated to an involution as the inexistent double points. So it was a bit anathema for Segre. As he said, that definition, it seems to me, should be absolutely rejected because it evidently contains something absurd in itself, at the same time introduces the imaginary elements as a term that does not stand for any geometric entity. So the question was really how you do a real geometry with real geometric entities. So if you look carefully, it is the involution itself, so the situation of the involution, which he said Staudt calls imaginary element and not the double element, the points, the imaginary point fixed by it. So the imaginary element is a geometric entity and it is legitimate to reason and taken it as an object of study. But you have to understand that while we think of points and complex points as real object, in this case you couldn't think of the complex points as real object. But what Segre suggested really is to put a geometrical situation of involution as a geometrical object. So it's a kind of much more abstract view on what could be a geometrical object, of course, that simply points. It was possible because between von Staudt and the development of Segre, what was at the beginning a relation between two geometrical figures had become a transformation that is a mathematical object itself. We would not speak about relation between figures, projective relation or involutory relation. You would speak as an involution that is an application transforming one figure into another. And that allows you somehow to see, it's a very important semantic change, to see the relation no more as a relation, but as a mathematical object that is as an object in itself, which is the transformation. So just to fix idea about that, the projectivity, I mean, all the transformation, involution, and so on are transformations. And it allows, in particular, Segre to extend the type of application transformation he would consider, because as I explained, Staudt, looking at relation between things, only considered relations which preserve not only the harmonicity and this type of relation, but also a kind of direction. And he was obliged to attach direction to things in order to be able to develop his theory. But now that we can somehow get rid of the relation and look only at the application, it was possible to introduce other application, preserving harmonicity also, but not necessarily the direction. So that's what Segre did. So just to fix idea analytically, he would consider not only the projectivity, which are given by the Möbius transformation, the homography, but also what he called anti-projectivity, which associated to a variable, the homography, but with the Z bar and not the Z. Okay? So it's a new type of application, and if you look at all the setting also with sort of application, you can look at the involution, you can look at the double point, the fixed points of the involutions, and if you express that analytically, you would find that they are given by an Hermitian form. So, as Segre recognized it, he said that this form has been already introduced in number theory by Hermite, Picard, and others. So this anti-involution being introduced and associated with an Hermitian form, he will then develop a whole theory of these Hermitian forms as geometrical objects. So for instance, antipolarity which associated polarity associated to a point, a line. So you have the same situation with antipolarity, and in this case, you can associate that to an emission form with more variables, and so on and so on. So you have new object, new kind of variety in some respect, geometrical variety, which are defined by emission form by Segre, sorry. So I will not comment on that, but just because I'm running out of my time. But this is the setting in which people after Segre would put back metric definitions in this new geometry, defining emission metrics, in particular Fubini and Studi metrics would be the first example of the Keller metric and the Cartan metric we have spoken on. So in this case, sorry. Just this. It's interesting that Segre would try to use this new setting to establish contact with several mathematicians in Europe. In particular, we have here a letter which is sent to Hurwitz, trying to draw his attention on his work on geometry to use it in his number theoretical work. So now, very briefly, I would go back. So just to remind you what was here the general setting. In order to understand the Segre situation and the introduction of emission form into geometry, you have to take account a lot of factors. So the general development and renewal of Italian mathematics, the role and organization of translation, the role of organization of engineering school, geometry being as general as analysis with its own methods, but then trying to establish new links with domains, and against transformation as key objects, and emission form becoming now geometric objects and not special species of quadratic form. So in the 2 minutes I have left, or 1 minute I have left, I just wanted to come back to the questions, open questions, and in particular to the question of long-term histories. Because I try to show you the complexity of each situation we are able to see in one specific work. And of course, the question is, how can you write a general history, for instance, of emission forms, which would take into account all the level and all the scales of these various layer of important components you can find in each one. So you have, for instance, if I try to do that, it will look like that. So here you have seen, I just put on the blackboard all the papers dealing with emission forms in green and other papers related to them during the period, and some of the links between them. Okay, so it's a very complicated and bizarre picture, and we would like to find out how to describe this thing. And this is really an open question. I have just described very briefly and very superficially a few points in this picture, and all of them, well, there are more in the written version, but all of them are important for the general picture. So we have to understand links, and links could be a variety of them. Bibliographical references, choice of journals, for instance, of correspondence, courses, links between things, as we have seen, translations, of course, but also links could be given by mathematical objects. For instance, the very important role of transformation from Hermite to Segre via Klein and so on is very important during the period and a bit unexpected. Also, you can find links in theorem proof by a variety of persons, but I have no time to discuss that. And more generally, classification program, the type of validation for new object, the new role of linear algebra, which has been studied by Hawkins, for instance, but also more recently by Frederick Brescian-Mara. We'll speak probably about that this afternoon. All these things constitute layers and components which have different scale in time and which are important to look at. I just want to say one word before closing. that not only continuity, I mean links are important for our description, but something which I think is very important for the development of history of math and for which we have no answer at the moment is to understand discontinuity. We have a lot of case study about that, and we have inherited theories of discontinuities from history of science, for instance, Kuhn's idea of scientific revolution or Lakatos research program, but in fact they don't work well for mathematics, and it's quite important to understand what happens, why some things are forgotten, or what happens that something is not developed at one point and another. And we missed really a lot of reflection and development for model changes in history of mathematics. So it's, for me, a very important issue to solve. So thank you very much. I would say that I will share my dream with you. Several persons have discussed their dreams. And so my dream will be that history of mathematics could become an art to giving the same name, but name coming from history of mathematics, not possibly the name given directly by the mathematicians themselves, to the different things we have seen, and a lot of different things that make mathematics so rich and so complicated to describe. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for a really rich and wonderful talk, I think, showing the complexities of not just of mathematics, but also the complexities for historians of mathematics, and for sharing your dream with us. Unfortunately, as you all know, we don't have time for questions from the floor, but I'm sure Catherine would be very happy to discuss her work with any of you if you would like to come up and speak to her after the session closes now. So it just remains for me to ask you to thank Catherine again for giving us such a wonderful exposition.